The underlying question we were aiming to get answered as part of that research is, what do vendors miss from their partners? That's kind of the big question we're trying to answer.
Welcome to TBR Talks, decoding strategies and ecosystems of the globe's top tech firms, where we talk business model disruption in the broad technology ecosystem, from management consultancies to systems integrators, hyperscalers to independent software vendors, telecom operators to network and infrastructure vendors, and chip manufacturers to value-added resellers. We'll be answering some of the key intelligence questions we've heard from executives and business unit leaders among the leading professional IT services and telecom vendors. Today, we'll be talking about our new ecosystem research with Boz Hristov, Principal Analyst for TBR's Digital Transformation Practice. All right, Boz, so this summer, TBR rolled out its latest ecosystem report, this time around voice of the partner. Can you tell me, first of all, what is in the report, but then also, where did it come from? Why did we decide to do this?
Yeah, happy to. So what's in the report? So what we did was we looked into the market and trying to understand how the relationships between the kind of the key groups of vendors that we track here within TBR broadly are evolving, are changing. As you mentioned, it's the latest report as part of our ecosystem intelligence coverage. So what we want to understand is how vendors within the space we cover broadly in TBR are thinking of each other. So the three groups of vendors that we track within that report include the OEMs and infrastructure providers, the cloud providers, and we split that cloud vendor group within two subgroups, including the infrastructure as a service providers, like the hyperscalers, as well as the SaaS and the PaaS vendors, the likes of SAP and Oracle and Salesforce and Adobe, Snowflake and the likes. And then the third group of vendors is the professional services. So within that professional services group, it's kind of have four different subgroups: the management consultancies like the McKinsey and BCG, the Big Four, Deloitte, EY, KPMG, PwC, IT services vendors like Accenture and Capgemini and IBM, and then the last subgroup of those professional services is the India-centric vendors, the Infosys, TCS, Cognizant, HCL, and the likes. So looking at those three groups of vendors, really, the underlying question we were aiming to get answered as part of that research is, what do vendors miss from their partners? That's kind of the big question we're trying to answer. Obviously, that is a very broad question, which kind of led to a subset of different questions that we included in the survey. And the questions are kind of covering across commercial models, revenue sharing models, staffing models, expectations of what's changing, and really what's the closest and the most immediate opportunity, and the short and the long-term mid and long-term opportunities across the various groups. So essentially, we targeted alliance managers and above, executives that can speak to the relationship with their counterparts. So take, for example, targeting an alliance manager, somebody within Accenture who can speak about the relationship with their cloud providers or with the OEM providers, and think about their experience and their expectations with those two groups of vendors, whichever those two groups of specific vendors they might be working with. We did the same thing. We targeted similar set of questions, somebody at SAP, and have them talk about their expectations and their relationship and their sentiment about their experience with someone like at OEM or professional service providers. And we did the same thing with like somebody from Dell or Fujitsu, talking about their experience and expectations with someone from cloud and the professional services side. So we did a survey. We augmented that survey with in-depth interviews very much in a typical TBR way. We have one set of data. We're just building up additional data points that way, and providing that sentiment and calibrating and understanding, if something was missed as part of the survey, we're finding some new nuggets and nuances, and we're including some of those quotes, obviously, as part of the report. But it's a lot of data driven. A lot of the analysis, are rooted in the data of the survey, and then again, layered with TBR's analysis on top of that, and then further enhanced with those then quotes. So that's kind of what's in the report. It's again part of the series of ecosystem intelligence reports. It will, the way I see it, it will serve as a bridge and as a glue, I should say, not just as a bridge, but as a glue between the other set of ecosystem intelligence reports that we have already published or about to publish. So as you know, we have the cloud ecosystem report that we've been publishing for the better part of the last 2.5, 3 years now. We are in the second iteration of our Adobe and Salesforce ecosystem report, and we're about to launch our SAP, Oracle, and Workday ecosystem report at the end of this month. So in a way, we have ecosystem intelligence reports that cover the infrastructure ecosystem and the application ecosystem, and that voice of the partner ecosystem report essentially will allow readers to calibrate their expectations and understand the sentiment and what's changing in those relationships. So that's kind of the bigger overarching premise. To get to your second question, what drove the idea behind that report? We were getting a lot of questions from our clients over the last 18 months, I would say, about exactly that. How our partners think of us? How can we drive awareness by, for example, OEM providers coming to us and say, how can we make this systems integrators and consultancies sell more of our boxes, basically, essentially, right? Or what do hyperscalers think of us? And that's a question we were getting from the services providers and consultancies that are trying to expand and build their practices in the technology implementation space. So questions like that, or some of the questions we were getting were very much more transactional, I would say.
Right.
Thinking about tactical in terms of like the relationship and portfolio evolution and commercial models. I mentioned revenue sharing models. So we're trying to answer as many of those questions as possible as part of when we design the survey. Again, they're grouped by groups of vendors, and we're trying to use it as a tool, as a part of our ongoing research, as I said, to help us support those conversations and questions that we keep getting. Obviously, we cannot answer all the questions with one survey, but certainly provides a strong foundation that supports our ongoing ecosystem intelligence research and other questions we get from clients.
So in many ways, it's I like the idea. It's sort of the glue between them. It's a complementary report to a lot of the stuff that we've been publishing already around the ecosystem and also around the individual companies themselves. I want to ask you about who should read it, but before I get to that, sort of was there any one or two or three things that surprised you? I mean, you've been leading on the ecosystem intelligence reports for a while now, but was there anything that you learned from the survey or from the in-depth interviews that made you say, wow, okay, this is something different and this is something we gotta make sure people understand and see and read?
Something that surprised me. So a couple of things. First, there were some good confirmations that came through as a result of the survey that were largely rooted in the vendor's DNA. Meaning, we know how some of the organizations, broadly speaking, as a group, most of the vendors within a particular group operate. Consultancies trade on trust. OEMs looking more transactional kind of a approach to sell more, SKU-based sales. Cloud providers are looking more to spin the meter or sell licenses. Kind of like those are kind of like confirmations that we kind of got. But then when we start peeling back and understand like what's driving that behavior, what are some of the levers that those vendors can apply and the ecosystem to take in consideration, this is where it became a little bit more interesting and to a degree surprising, especially when it came to the outlook of how those companies behave and think about what's actually driving the business for them. So one of the nuanced data points that we saw was how, we all hear about Gen AI, right? For example, everybody's talking about Gen AI. Everybody's investing in Gen AI. It's certainly top of mind for vendors across all groups, for the buyers across the board. But when we ask the question, what is the expectations? What's going to be the top areas of growth that's coming, and those vendors are applying their expertise, are expecting to see the most growth come from. Gen AI was not in the top 3, it was not in the top 5, for some of them. I mean, there was more of a sober reality check that this survey provided us when it came to how they see the market changing. And I think that's an important nuance here, because we all want to drive what's the latest and greatest, right? And we hear as analysts, from the market a lot about this is what's happening. But when we have those more intimate or direct conversations with the vendors themselves, they provide a little bit more of a realistic picture and kind of like from expectation point of view. I'm not saying that Gen AI is not going to help drive a business for those companies, nor they're saying that. it's more about the ranking and the priorities and understanding what it takes for the market and the longevity it takes for a particular technology to come to play. For example, the OEMs are looking a little bit more, as a edge and 5G as areas to be really driving growth, more immediate growth, right?
Right.
The services providers are more on the data strategy and data management. The cloud providers obviously looking at the cybersecurity and cloud management. So there's those nuances that are, those short-term goals that are, I think it's important for vendors as they think about this, they go to market, especially the people that are on the ground, right? That they deal on a day-to-day basis,
Right.
that needs to have that a calibration of expectations of what exactly and how it gets messaged back to all the stakeholders that get involved. Because that essentially, if it doesn't get aligned, creates openings.
Right.
That's
Right.
that's the takeaway here. Because if one set of vendors is saying, well, we're going for 5G, and the other one is saying data strategy, and you're trying to sell each other's business, essentially their boxes or services or licenses, then it could become an issue. So I
Right.
think while there was a sentiment overall across the groups of the current experience of each other's partners was overall positive, with a couple of exceptions. There were some neutral and some slightly negative feedback. Overall, it was a positive feedback. But then when you look into what's coming next, and despite the fact that all these relationships are well organized and governed, there seems to be some gaps that are opening up, which I think is
Right.
something for others to explore.
So you mentioned some neutral or even negative. So I mean, obviously the people who were viewed neutral or negative need to dive into this report to see what they're doing wrong. But who else should be reading this? And I'm curious on asking that question in two ways. You mentioned at the very jump a bunch of different kinds of companies. I mean, you went through all the different subsets within the three large groups. So clearly a lot of them, but I'm curious if there's any that stand out. But then also within those companies or their alliance partners, what are some of the personas? Like who is this who in addition to someone just focused on alliances should be looking at this voice of the partner research?
Yeah, as I think I was just alluding to a moment ago, thinking about the calibration, alignment, and expectation, I think obviously boils down to sales, right? And joint sales effort, go-to-market effort. So sales is certainly a part of that team, and sales enablement teams is trying to be more integrated. But I think it's also strategy. I think it's about internal strategy development and how they support how the company moves in what direction, and how that feeds back into the strategy of the organization, how they position themselves in the market. Because while often a lot of those companies drive direct sales, many are increasingly relying even more on their partner ecosystem. So understanding how your partners behave and what motivates them, I think it's as equally important as how they actually direct salespeople are trying to do this.
Right.
I think one of the big change we're expecting to see based on the results, especially someone like the OEM providers. Historically they have been heavily relying on the direct salespeople, and which is, they've been successful with that.
Yeah.
It has worked.
Yep.
But they're realizing the value of the ecosystem even more today than it probably were, 3 years ago, 5 years ago. They're expecting, so the expectations about how they position themselves with the partners and see the value of the partners came through. Most notably, we had a question around the idea around multi-partner relationships and how they perceive them, like the super groups as we call them. So in the current format, the cloud and service providers were not opposed to, where the OEM providers were a little bit like, kind of goes up against our DNA when the direct salespeople. But when we ask about looking forward 3 to 5 years, actually the OEM providers were the most excited about having an opportunity to be part of such group, which means that they're looking for partners like services providers and consultancies or others that can help them be, attached to, because they realize how much more value the ecosystem carries in the market.
Yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned, and I'll tie this two thoughts together. Strategy being as important as alliance management, and I think that to me resonates, because I know a lot of the questions we got about this, those questions were not coming from alliance managers. No. They were coming from people in strategy development at our clients who were saying, we're looking at the big picture, we're trying to figure out growth for the next 5 years. And so I would tie that right back to those OEMs. I mean, that's where the questions are going to come from. That's who's going to get a lot of value out of this report, not just the alliance managers that are looking at the I'm responsible for this alliance and this alliance, but the strategy development folks that are saying, okay, as a whole, what are we doing here?
Absolutely, yeah, and I think this is the underlying work here that we've done with this report. And just to kind of wrap up my thoughts on who else needs to read that and who might be appealing to this report. As I mentioned before, the misalignment and if those gaps are not addressed creates openings. So I think we also get a lot of questions from tier two vendors, so-called. Like, I don't want to discount anyone's value proposition,
Right.
but tier two means of size, right? Somebody like it's a certain threshold. Smaller vendors, they're trying to go upstream to expand their wallet share and trying to partner better or differently
Right.
with some of the larger providers, especially as they target large enterprises. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for those types of readers within those vendors to consider and see where their value proposition aligns with potentially with other vendor groups that maybe others are missing. So I think that's another group of readers that could benefit from that report.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And there are more tier 2 players than there are tier 1 players.
Yep.
So there's lots of opportunity there. All right, 2 more questions, both of them easy, I think. So as they say, no good deed goes unpunished. So you did this report and it looks at these 3 different vendor groups.
Yep.
And I believe it was US only in terms of the survey, right?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
So the next version of this report, do you anticipate expanding to other regions, or do you anticipate adding another vendor group like the networking providers, or what? Voice of the Partner 2025, what's that report look like?
I would say all the above. We
All
already been getting questions about geographical expansion
Yep.
from clients that are currently subscribing to the report and asking, more about, is there, what is that how do those numbers look like in Europe or in Asia Pacific, right? So that's
Right.
definitely top of mind already because they're just our client base, it is. But the other groups of vendors, I would say so because as we look into, as we have the telecom practice here within technology business research, it's an important component of the ecosystem. I mentioned a moment ago so how someone like, the OEMs looking into the edge or 5G as a priority area for them to grow their business, that certainly drive conversations with someone like within the telecom provider group. So I would not, miss an opportunity to add more vendors,
Right.
in the next iteration.
Right, makes a ton of sense. All right, last question. A couple of weeks ago, I sat down here with Ben Carbonneau and we talked about barbecue because the last time we traveled, we had gone to Texas. And I asked him if he had had barbecue as good as what he had in Texas, and if so, where. And his answer was pretty funny because he threw his family under the bus. But I'm curious whether or not you have had barbecue as good as we had at Franklin's in Austin since we got back.
It's funny. I spent time in Europe, so there was a different kind of barbecue, not this not American kind of barbecue. So I still think Franklin's is on top
Okay.
of the list.
All right.
But there's some travel coming up in the fall, so
This is true.
I'm sure we'll be looking for barbecue places, and there's something to be said about good barbecue. So
Hell yeah.
looking
Nothing wrong.
forward for the next best one.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you, Boz.
Yeah, thank you.
Next week, I'll be speaking with Alex Demule about our new Salesforce and Adobe ecosystem analysis. Don't forget to send us your key intelligence questions on business strategy, ecosystems, and management consulting through the form in the show notes below. Visit tbri.com to learn how we help tech companies large and small answer these questions with the research, data, and analysis my guests bring to this conversation every week. Once again, I'm your host, Patrick Heffernan, Principal Analyst at TBR. Thanks for joining us and see you next week.